What's wrong with integration? Thought, philosophy, doctrine, strategy, tactic. Today we're mostly talking at the doctrine and strategy level as we continue a conversation about how to paint a new picture for Black America. Now, my friend Jay Myers told me that I'm verbose. And Jay, you're right, I'm verbose. But I like to respond to what people say. And so for those of you who have the Twitter-sized attention spans, here's the cliff notes. What's wrong with integration? It dilutes your political power. It cripples your ability to create an economic infrastructure, and it rips the fabric of your community institutions. That's the short of it. We're going to talk a little bit more at length, but for those of you who, are used to receiving information in 140 characters, I hope that y'all will condense that down and make it something that, that your people can understand and appreciate. But for those of you who don't mind a more substantive discussion, I want to talk a little bit about what's wrong with integration, because when you introduce nationalism into a public conversation, it's important that you honor the movements that have come before. I mean, we all stand on, the shoulders of giants, as it were. And so here 50 years into the integration experiment, it seems appropriate to analyze and to assess what the impact has been on Black people in America. Now, I would posit to you that integration harmed our community in three very specific ways. And after I kind of outline the how and why that harm was done, we'll talk a little bit about the civil rights movement and how to properly honor it and how to properly see the relationship between what we're doing now and what they were doing then, because the two are definitely connected and there's no reason for there to be animosity between the two sides. So we live in a country where political power is divided up by population. And so when it comes time to send representatives to the federal system, the nation is divided up into districts. There are 435. You take the population and you draw lines where you can get the population of the country divided into 435 parts, and each one of those parts has roughly the same population size. So if you take a hypothetical mass of 100,000 Black people and you sit them down in one community, it is going to be very difficult to carve them out of the political representation. There's 100,000 of them. They're sitting right there. When you integrate, you take that mass of 100,000 people and you disperse them into the wider population. And so now, rather than sitting in a mass of 100,000, you've got 10 over here, you've got 100 over there, you've got 14,000 over here, you've got 6 over there, you've got 1 over there. And when you come to divide the groups, when you come to divide the country up into its congressional districts, those people will never represent a power center big enough to have their concerns addressed. It's a purely political problem. And so if you are analyzing integration from not an emotional standpoint, but from a purely practical standpoint, that's not a flaw in the system. That's how the system is designed. So if you set that as your ultimate goal, what you are establishing is a scenario in which you are reducing your own political power in the machine that you are trying to fight. That's problem number one. Problem number two is that it cripples your ability to create an economic infrastructure. So it's 2016, and as of today, there is no such thing as Black macroeconomics. There's no There's no business infrastructure, there's no investment infrastructure, there's no banking infrastructure, and there's no economic trade and commerce infrastructure that supports the black community, small or large. In this mass of 100,000 people, this scenario that we've painted, communities are made up of businesses and residences and commercial activities and organizations. And so economic integrity comes from the trade of goods and services for money and the churning of that money through a community so that it can be used multiple times. So if you live in a neighborhood and your grocery store, your clothing store, your food store, your shoe store, your home goods store, your toy store, your music store are all in that community. And the people who own those businesses also live in that community, and they frequent the same grocery stores and retail stores and manufacturers that you do. When you go to spend $1 at the grocery store with the black grocer, when he goes to buy a pair of shoes, he goes right around the corner and spends the money that you gave him for groceries on a pair of shoes. And then that guy that owns the shoe store, when he gets ready to go and do some home improvements or buy a toy for his child, he goes down the street and around the corner and he gives that money to another black business owner. What you're doing is you're allowing that money to cycle through the community over and over and over and over again. That's what creates the infrastructure through which you can grow a community. Because over time, you start to see these businesses grow and to look for capital and to want to expand. And as long as that expansion is happening inside the community, you start to see new jobs, because this grocery store is now expanding. They're going to add, some new department or something, and that creates jobs. And those jobs can be held by the people who live in that community. And they begin to save, and they begin to invest, and they begin to start their own businesses. This is an economic infrastructure. Well, if you take those 100,000 people and you disperse them out, the needs of that core group don't really change. And we'll talk for a minute about, we'll talk in a second about who it is that leaves and why that damages the community. But the needs don't change. And so now what you've done is you have taken these black businesses that would have helped churn that money, and you have spread them out further geographically. And so now when I want to see a black doctor, I have to go across town. When I want to consult with a black attorney, I got to go halfway around the other way. When I want to get an education for my son, I have to drive, further down this way. And in a world where fuel cost matters, people will typically opt for the most convenient option. And so on two fronts, we lose our ability to create an economic infrastructure. On the first front, the needs that are in our community ultimately end up being met by someone else. And so instead of you spending your money with the grocer and the grocer walking around the corner and buying a pair of shoes, you spend your money with someone from another community, and at the end of the day, they take the money that you gave them and they walk it out. And so it becomes part of an economic infrastructure in their community to help them churn back and forth, because if it's a Korean hair store and they take all the weave money that you give them, hundreds and hundreds and thousands of dollars every week, and they don't put it back into your community, they go and buy shoes from a Korean cobbler, and they go and buy toys from a Korean toy store, and they go and eat food at a Korean restaurant, what you're doing is you are propping up their macroeconomy. This is something that happens with integration, because our merchant class and our retail class and our manufacturing class, instead of looking at sustaining us, looks at profit as a primary motive and seeks to find business opportunities outside the community. And all of our money then goes outside the community with them. And there's nothing with which to build an economic infrastructure. The third thing that happens, and there are many, many criticisms that you could offer of any political ideology. These are those that I'm offering specifically for integration. But the third thing that happens is you lose the integrity of your community institutions. So when you open up a community and you say, all those that don't want to stay here can go seek opportunities elsewhere, the people who are most likely to take you up on the offer are the people whose skills and whose knowledge are best transferable to somewhere else. For us, that has always been our professional class. So when you fling open the doors of the community, it's the doctors, it's the lawyers, it's the architects, it's the manufacturers that leave because those skills are transferable somewhere else. It is the people who rely on those people for jobs, for employment, and for provision of products and services that suffer, because now you have sucked all of the brain power out of the community, and what's left is the people who are not positioned in society to be part of that merchant class who feel the entire weight of that migration. Along with that, when those people leave, typically we lose the leadership that was a part of that community. If you walk into almost any primarily black institution, you will find that the people in charge are usually the people with the best educations and the people with the most recognizable position in white America. So that's your talented 10th. And they also happen to be the people who are best positioned to make their exodus when you open the doors. So you're left with institutions, churches, hospitals, Masonic lodges, and social organizations that lose the level of leadership that has kept them a part of the community and made them such an important part of the community for all these years. So these three components combined basically pull your community apart at the seams because it has no integrity anymore. So in assessing it as a political ideology that we should follow, you have to ask yourself, in order to be fair, what were the integrationists trying to accomplish? And if you look at the doctrine of integration, what you see is that the people who believe in it are operating under the assumption that given access to America's levers of power, over time, black people will become indistinguishable from the rest of America by virtue of the fact that we will get the same outcomes from the same opportunities. So the particular strategy that the civil rights movement had in mind was legislation to end desegregation and to allow integration. Now, had they decoupled them, perhaps we would have gotten a different outcome. It is absolutely true that if I'm driving down the road and I need to make use of a bathroom and I come upon a building that has a bathroom in it, I should be able to use that bathroom as a citizen in a public space. That's true. But beyond that, if the business owner does not want to do business with me, why on earth would I want to force him to take my money? And so you get to this distinction between the desegregation piece and the integration piece. And you find that the strategy that they pursued was to seek legislation from Congress that would both desegregate and open for integration all of America. So they achieved that objective. And had the philosophy worked the way integrationists presumed that it would, you would start to see us moving closer to invisibility in society. Now, what does that mean? If integration worked, when you looked at infant mortality rates, you would be unable to pull black people out of that statistical data set and say they're getting a significantly different effect from all the things that we're doing than the rest of America. When you looked at income, when you looked at poverty levels, when you looked at employment, when you looked at home ownership, when you looked at generational wealth, when you looked at health outcomes, when you looked at education, we would be indistinguishable from the rest of society. That was the goal. That was the belief that they were operating under. But when you look at statistical analysis of the population of America, what you see is that black people are in no way indistinguishable from the rest of society. You can see us clearly in the outcomes of every category. We have higher crime. We have higher poverty. We have higher unemployment. We have we have lower infant mortality rates. We have worse health outcomes. We have inferior education. We have less generational wealth. And so in all of these areas where integration should have made us invisible, for whatever sociological reason, that hasn't been the outcome that we've gotten. So at some point, we have to look back at what they were doing both strategically and doctrinally, and we have to say, was it effective? Did it work? Well, 50 years later, not only did it not work, we're sliding in many of those categories. So it's getting progressively worse. It's always dangerous to talk about the civil rights movement negatively because it's such a pivotal moment in American history. And it is difficult to offer critique of the policy objectives without sounding like you are offering a critique of the people. Look, Dr. Martin Luther King is one of the greatest American icons that this nation has ever produced. He stands virtually alone as an orator. He is iconic in the role that he has played globally in how people perceive civil rights. And these are aspects of his legend that are to be honored. But Dr. King was born in 1929, and his contemporaries on the political science stage are men like Strom Thurmond, George Wallace, George McGovern. These are people who also championed various political movements, and over time, the things that they started have morphed into something completely different. And that's because in those movements, people are constantly putting new ideas on the table. And so they're adjusting themselves. And if you look at the conservative movement in the Republican Party going back to 1968 or even to 1964, you see this fledgling movement. Well, in the next 30 years, they've had 3 presidents, and they have had a complete sea change in what conservatism means and what its role is in the Republican Party. That's political evolution. Meanwhile, we are hanging on to Dr. King's philosophy that was designed for people at a specific moment in time, and we are refusing to allow it to evolve so that we can use new philosophy and new thought and new doctrine to create new solutions for the problems that we now face. And so it is unfair to that movement to not allow it to be broken apart, to be analyzed. That's what we're supposed to do. We're supposed to take problems apart, figure out what their components are, address those components so that we can ultimately get rid of the problem. But instead, we take one tactic from what was an overarching philosophy that had specific reasons for the steps that it took to accomplish what it did. We take that one tactic, the protest march, and we make it the sum total of our political environment, of our political involvement. It's a recipe for disaster because the times have changed, the threats are different. And so at this point, the move from integration to nationalism is not a move that is designed to be a slap in the face at the integrationists. They tried. But the reality on the ground as best exemplified by this current constitutional crisis that we're facing, is that as a political ideology, it is a bad fit and it has given the wrong solutions to Black America. And so that's what's wrong with integration, in my view. And that's why I think that it's important for us to throw some new ideas on the table so that we're not left trying to fight the next war with the tactics from the last. This is an evolving situation. America is not the country that it was 50 years ago. We are not in the situation that we were in 50 years ago. And so we have to look at some new tactics. And so the next question that people typically ask is, well, why not just use a purely political process to solve this problem? After all, politics is the venue where this would take place. And there is a very checkered and interesting history between blacks in America and the American political parties. And the next time we get together to talk, I want to talk about that for a minute. What is the current relationship between Black America and the political parties, the two political parties, and what should it be or could it be? I think that's something that we should address as we take a look at what would moving Black American politics from the far left a little bit further right, what would that look like? So that's what we'll tackle next time. For those of you that hung out with me for the whole time, I appreciate it. As always, I expect and look forward to your harshest criticism. I understand that these are new ideas, and I understand that they challenge some very, very sacred cows. But we are in a crisis, and we have to start challenging our sacred cows, or we won't have done everything that we can do to push off our pending destruction. I'm not going to keep flooding Facebook with these, so if you'd like to continue participating in this conversation, feel free to follow this to subscribe to this YouTube channel. I'm not going to be asking anybody for money or anything like that. I just think we need a space where we can start to flesh out some bigger ideas. You can follow me on Twitter at JustStew, Justew. It's one word. Look forward to hearing from you. Peace.